Right. So it is my pleasure to welcome you both here in the room and online on behalf of the FeBo team and also of Serena Luzzi and Dennis Viva to our 19th FeBinar, the talks organized as part of our ERC project FeBo. This FeBinar in particular is also part of the multidisciplinary project Confini Instabili, connessioni transfrontaliere fra patrimonio culturale, materialità e Grenzgänger, funded by the Italian Ministry of University and Research in the framework of the Excellence Project 2022-2027 and led by our colleagues Serena Luzzi and Dennis Viva here in Trento. In the framework of this project, they organize a series of lectures involving so far art historians, geographers, experts on ancient Rome and the history of the Middle Ages. Today, however, it is the turn of ancient Greek history. Jeremy McInerney, is the pronunciation right? Okay. Will take us into the world of soft borders, so important that they have become as influential as Maplines. Songs and myth, capable of drawing and redrawing relational borders, deeply dynamic, not coinciding with material ones. Professor Jeremy McInerney does not need a presentation, of course, but as usual, I'm sharing with the younger students the highlights of his career. He got his PhD in ancient history and Mediterranean archaeology at the University of California. And he's Davidson Kennedy Professor of Classical Studies at the University of Pennsylvania, where he has been for over 30 years by now, and where he's also co-director of the faculty. Among his numerous research interests, I'd like to draw your attention on some seminal articles and book. First of all, the book devoted to my favorite topic, the Phocians, with a wonderful title, The Falls of Parnassus, Land and Ethnicity in Ancient Phokis, published in 1999, as well as an important article on network theory as a way of understanding the development and the role of sanctuaries in regional settings, a study of cattle in the Greek world. He also edited a very important companion to another very important issue to FeBo, that is the companion to ethnicity in the ancient Mediterranean, Blackwell, a chapter devoted to the Phocians in the so-called New Larsen, and another challenging chapter devoted to the role of Iampolis and the sanctuary of Calapod in the volume edited and just published, edited by Katja Sporn and Laufer. Today, he will share with us some intriguing cases of borders between cultural zones, songlines to map lines, why borders matter. And it is time to give him the floor. Thank you.
Yes. Thank you, Eleanor. Thank you very much for coming along this afternoon, folks. Today's paper will be a little bit of a departure from some of the usual work that I've been doing and that FeBo has been involved in, involving Greek borders. I want to expand our range a little bit. When Donald Trump recently floated the idea of the US acquiring Greenland, then German Chancellor Olaf Scholz pushed back, stating that the inviolability of borders applied to every country, no matter whether it's a very small one or a very powerful one. This clear statement was rooted in the familiar principle that borders are critical to the definition of states. It is a sentiment that would have made total sense in the 4th century BC, when Cleochares of Chalkis remarked that, quote, the citizens of small states fear the diplomacy of greater states. Borders are also changeable, negotiable, and as we've seen, catnip to a president for whom there are no principles, only transactions. Our anger at Trump's refusal to recognize one border's integrity while insisting on building a wall to monumentalize another risks causing us to lose sight of some other features of boundaries. They aren't inevitable, even if they are natural, and they are finally, like money, a collaborative fiction that only works as long as we're prepared to treat them as real. Let me illustrate this by exploring some other ways of understanding borders, and I'm going to do so by contrasting two almost inconceivably different ways of imagining borders. Here is Australia, the sunburnt country, in all its natural glory as a continent. If one were to ask what borders naturally fit into this continent, or onto this continent, one might plumb for territories defined by rainfall or by elevation. But you probably would not draw the borders like this map from 1851. By that time, convict colonies had been established on the East Coast. Recidivists, repeat offenders, were sent down to the truly evil convict settlements in Van Diemen's Land, modern-day Tasmania. One penal colony had been established in the West, and a single free settlement had been established in Adelaide to become the capital of South Australia. The sole territory, and later state, with no convict heritage. Gradually, these widely dispersed settlements gained control of their hinterlands and employed surveyors to create this, the map of an entire continent marked by borders of mathematical precision, except along the course of the Murray River between Victoria and New South Wales. And yet, despite the triumph of the European notion of state borders, transported to Australia along with those desperately poor convicts and their guardians, there was here a land of people whose borders could be expressed entirely differently. As dozens of language groups, many not mutually intelligible, yet intimately connected to the land, defining it in ways that no European was equipped to see or hear. For the indigenous people, songlines were more important than maplines, and unlike the utter mathematical precision and unreality of the maplines, songlines were lived and breathed through song and dance, and storytelling expressed in sky lore and myth. As here in the Emu in the Sky constellation, used by the Ualei people of Central Australia to remind them when the time was good for collecting emu eggs. Ground markers, sometimes approximating sky markers, were sung back into existence, taught to young initiates, even even painted, sometimes even temporarily. This is the so-called Emu constellation, and it is then mimicked on a rock-cut shelter down below. Subject to an elaborate system of taboos and mysteries, some were male initiations, some were part of women's business. They mapped the places of communities. You can see here a series of water holes and the tracks that lead between them. They mapped the places of communities on the ground and in the cosmos, providing boundaries that correspond to the limits of territory, not owned, but experienced. They delineated not property, but the particular portions of land through which people passed, either hunting or gathering or traveling to sacred sites. If borders arise from a pressure to separate, songlines complement, C-O-M-P-L-E, complement this, with an equally powerful urge to aggregate, to bring people together, sometimes temporarily, people whose affiliations are complex networks of tribe, descent, marriage, cult group, and clan. If the contrast between these Aboriginal notions of songlines and the European notion of state borders is about as extreme a polarity as we can imagine, I bring this contrast to our attention to foreground the contingency of Greek borders. They are a useful fiction that helps to create political and cultural realities. One last example drawn from outside the Greek world to illustrate the role of boundaries in dynamic cultural formation. In the 3rd century BC, when many Greek ethne and polis were experiencing a quickening of the urge to make borders definite, Greeks abroad encountered Buddhist rulers of the Mauryan dynasty eager to proselytize. Ashoka, the grandson of Chandragupta, dispatched embassies at the western edge of his empire and erected pillar monuments that in effect served as horoi, as marker stones, if you will, but the claims they made were very distinctive. Now is the conquest by Dharma, justice, that beloved of the gods, Ashoka, considers to be the best conquest, and conquest by Dharma, has been won here on the borders, even 600 yojanas away, where the Greek king Antiochus rules, beyond there where the four kings named Ptolemy, Antigonus, Magas, and Alexander rule, likewise in the south among the Cholas, the Pandyas, and as far away as Tapraparni, Sri Lanka. Here in the king's domain, among the Greeks, the Cambodians, and the rest of it's been cut off, sorry. In this remarkable document, at first sight, it seems as if the hard political business of border negotiations has been transformed into moral improvement. But as if the border urge has been displaced, but not entirely, since Ashoka continues. I've had this Dharma edict written so that my sons and great-grandsons may not consider making new conquests, or that if military conquests are made, that they be done with forbearance and light punishment, or better still, that they consider making conquest by Dharma only, for that bears fruit in this world and the next. May all their intense devotion be given to this, which has a result in this world and the next. So borders may be the product of political and military difference, but they can also allied over into the realms of moral discourse, or they may give expression, as in the Aboriginal case, to an entirely different phenomenology. In fact, on the borders of the Greek world, precisely where Ashoka saw the triumph of Dharma, the Greeks imagined the existence of weird and monstrous creatures described by Ctesias, Megasthenes, and later the Alexander romance, as a world of skiapods, people whose feet provide them shade, blemiers, people with a head in the middle of their chest, and monocoli, people with one eye. And these would remain on the borders of the European imagination right into the illustrated editions of Marco Polo and Sir John Mandeville. This is the standard way that Europeans see the border of their known world. The same border, but construed by one side as monstrosity and by the other as orderliness. The use of monstrosity to give borders a face was significant in Greek culture, with its concern for policing boundaries. The blurring of the boundaries between male and female was portrayed through the hermaphrodite, while the dangers of mixing with non-Greeks was given expression on the metopes of temples in those colonial settings where Greeks and indigenous people rubbed shoulders. As Foucault explained, the transgression of natural limits, the transgression of classifications, that's the real question of monstrosity. So borders go hand in hand with making monsters. So the settlements that have been the subject of the FeBo seminars, grow out of a rich engagement with a deep underlying concern for orderliness that is not limited to territorial boundaries. With this wide array of possible significance, what do we find when we return to Greek boundaries? What exactly do they demarcate? In the world of Greek border arbitration, the answer seems straightforward. A border, such as the border between Ambrissus and Delphi, separates two autonomous communities with a dividing line. This is one that I worked on some years ago, while I was a grad student, in fact. So here's a fairly typical example of a Greek border inscription. It's broken off, God, good fortune, blah, 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 what is called by the left side on the stream flows, should belong to the Delphians until Igoneia. From Igoneia, as the stream flows through the ravine at the ridge called Kerdon, until the road which leads to the Holmoke, the right side should belong to the Phlegonians and Ambricians, whereas the left should belong to the Delphians. from the road until the Holmoke at Catopterion, from Catopterion straight along the ridge to the Sharp Rock, from the rock straight onto Petrikos. I'm going through this in detail so you get a feel for what a typical Greek border arbitration looks like on the ground. The area to the east of this line shall belong to the Phlegonians and the Ambricians, while the parts to the west shall belong to the Delphians. The stream flowing past Igonia shall belong to all of them in common. And if there are any sanctuaries in these places, they should continue to function as they have from the beginning. So the characteristics of this are very familiar, and many of you will recognize this. One, local toponyms that make more sense to the people who already know the land. These are already rooted in the farmers' and pastoralists' knowledge of the land. The use of watercourses as natural dividers anchoring the political border in the territory. 3, stipulations regarding common or shared resources. And finally, recognition of established practices, particularly in relation to sacred sites. Yet, if these seem obvious, there are other features that are relevant, yet are completely murky. Why was this border an issue? Were there special circumstances that made it important for one side or the other to assert control over the resources on either side of the line? Now, we might expect competition over resources. The Oxyrhynchus historian reports that conflicts used to break out on Parnassus between the Phocians and the Locrians grazing their sheep on the mountain in summertime. Access to pasture land was contested, and I intend exploring the question of borderland resources more tomorrow in the colloquium. But I'm citing the Ambrissus Delphi settlement primarily to suggest the following. First, that the precise issues and pressures impelling border definition are not at all obvious. Second, that the respective parties are frequently not equivalent in power or status. Delphi is a major sanctuary, Ambrissos was not, and Phlegonion, possibly Styrus or Castruli on the plateau of Xerovuni, was an even lower tier site. So these aren't equals dealing with each other. These are powerful places and satellite or subsidiary places. So why do less significant places separated from Delphi by ridges and plateau engage in border management with a major Pan-Hellenic sanctuary? I also use this to draw attention to the fact that in Greece there is often a great deal lurking behind a border inscription. Other types of borders, religious, cultic, and cultural, may be intersecting with these hard land borders or may be operating according to entirely different criteria. Inscriptions, for example, employing local alphabets, evoke dialectical differences that were just as significant as lines on a map to assert difference. You'll be familiar with, some of you will be familiar with this. The Ambracia Polyandrion, about which I spoke here in this very room 2 years ago, for example, uses the Corinthian alphabet to make a clear claim regarding the city's place. Non-Greeks couldn't read it. And other Greeks could only read it if they, A, could read, and B, if they could decipher Corinthian letters. If you were an Athenian trained in the Attic Greek that we were all trained on, when you first look at this, it looks very strange because the letter forms are not familiar. Here, visual and auditory markers establish a boundary between Greek and non-Greek, between Ambratiot Greek and other Greek. Orally, the Greeks encountered borders every day, like Theocritus' ladies in Idyll 15. When Gorgo and Praxinoa complain of nearly getting trampled, remember that the stranger they have encountered complains about their prattling and says that their broad alphas are an assault on the ear. To which Praxinoa replies, Ma pothen anthropos, tidetine kotilai emes. Now listen to the second line. Pasamenos epitase syrakosiais epitasais. In that second line, out of 17 syllables, 5 are alphas and 1 is an alpha iota diphthong, pretty emphatically drawing attention to the distinctive sound of their speech to other Greeks. They understand their words, but the accent is actually a barrier. To do justice to this, I'm going to read you an English translation that actually uses a fairly broad accent. I defy you to understand it. Struth, mate, who put you in charge? So what if we're having a bit of a chin wag? Stop giving orders, because you're giving orders to a couple of Syracusan ladies. That's right, we're Corinthian, way back, just like Bellerophon. We talk Peloponnesian. I reckon it's all right to talk Doric if you're a Dorian, yeah? Michael looks puzzled. It's a fairly broad Australian accent to use that, and we can talk later on about how much of that you actually followed. I don't know. Connections, discourses of similarity and difference shaped Greek life in ways that were frequently at odds with the notion of settled borders. For example, in Western Greece, while there were Aetolian and Acarnanian koina, there was also a Corinthian economic zone. These are the places that used Pegasoi, the coins that were famous from Corinth. Not a koinon, but a space in which the circulation of Pegasoi from Corinth to Ambracia to Syracuse effectively meant that there was a zone in which common coinage facilitated trade and communication. But here too, the centripetal aggregative impulse towards systematization and commonality is in constant tension with irregularity. Corinth, Kerkyra, and Ambracia all minted and used Pegasoi, but at the Battle of Sibota in 432 BC, 27 Ambracite ships fought alongside Corinthian ships against Kerkyrian ships. While Kerkyra sometimes minted coins, generally on a standard commensurate with the Corinthian, one Kerkyran stater of 11.4 grams was the equivalent of 4 Corinthian drachmae. At times, the Kerkyrians also minted coins along using a distinctly non-Corinthian, using non-Corinthian motifs such as the cow and suckling calf, and even on different standards, such as this stater from the period between 450 and 420, which weighs 9.82 grams, more than a gram heavier than the standard Corinthian stater of 8.6. Each aspect of Greek life, therefore, is characterized by fluidity. Different accents, different coins, different stories. The Gorgon in Athens and the Gorgon in Argos are not the same. In the Peloponnese, the Gorgon is part of the initiation of young boys who, like little Perseus's, must kill Gorgo. That's one of the ways these masks from Tyrannus have been interpreted. In Athens, she's just a pretty girl about to be assaulted by a really creepy Perseus. This variation and the particularity of the many different Greek cultures within Greek culture is a powerful argument in favor of actor network theory, which would view the Greek world as an endless series of negotiated relationships. Avoiding essentializing approaches framed as definitional answers to my question, what is a border? This approach instead would ask, in what ways do shifting practices of border settlement reflect relationships between parties within the Greek world and reflect changes in those relationships? It's alive, is what I'm saying. Approaching borders from this situational perspective, that is to say, as nodes at the intersection of different lines drawn from politics, myth, and landscape, may offer a more dynamic view of border formation. Take, for example, Achelous. Viewed from the point of view of topography, the Achelous is simply a river in western Greece. It's the largest river in central Greece, to be sure, but at the level of brutal reality, it's a river. And as a big river, it offered a natural boundary marker for the two people on either side of it, the Aetolians and the Acarnanians. Unsurprisingly, then, when the border between these two koina was adjudicated after 263, the river was named as a border. Erenane men kai filian, potalalus philus aeontas kai simacus hamata panta chronon, horia ekontas tas horas ton, akaloion potamon acri es thalasan. Now, the nature realist approach would simply point out that this was a big watercourse and that therefore it was a natural border between two koina. If one favors this realist interpretation, then it's a short step to inferring that the marshland at the mouth of the Achelous was a principal source of contention. Maurice Sartre supposed precisely this when he asserted that border disputes often concerned good farming land. Elsewhere, this is a quote, he continues, there are marshes in the lower valley of the Achelous, disputed between the Aetolians and the Acarnanians, marshes which alone provide green fodder during the summer. Except that the treaty does not mention any dispute over the marsh, merely noting that the borderline, the river, passed through it. Marshland, which by definition couldn't be planted or cultivated, might be desirable for shepherds and their summer flocks, but they're actually more likely to head for the hills in summer, and in the winter, wet conditions made the land marginal at best. The border only makes a passing reference to the marsh, whereas it gives detailed attention to the reciprocal rights of the Acarnanians and Aetolians, such as epigamia, they can marry each other's population, enctasis, they can purchase lands in each other's territory, and politeia, or citizenship. Even more detailed are the stipulations about joint military action. In case of attack, both sides are obliged to send 1,000 infantry and 100 cavalry within 6 days, and if the threat persists, they're both obliged to send a further 3,000 men in 10 days. These stipulations also include the terms of compensation for the expeditionary forces, if they were needed beyond an initial deployment of 30 days. After that, 1 Corinthian stater per day per horseman, 2 drachmae for heavily armed infantry, 9 obolds for medium-armed infantry, 7 obolds for lightly armed. Now, you're wondering, why am I giving you these extraordinary details? Because these are not the terms and conditions for a treaty concerned with regulating summer fodder. There are about 2 organized states, state entities, experimenting with the reciprocal obligations. The terms, in fact, that they lay out bring the Aetolians and Acarnanians one step short of unification, of sympoliteia. And in one sense, therefore, the river separates them, but in another sense, it is the only thing that separates them. It's running counter to the political development of the area. So what else can we bring to the interpretation of Achelous other than that it was a big river? Well, what we have, frankly, is a very rich myth history. Achelous was conventionally depicted as a bull-bodied, human-headed god. See him here, over my shoulder. As here in this marble relief from Neofalido, a Megarian plaque of the 4th century places him in the middle of an assembly of Greek gods and goddesses associated with abundance and natural fertility. At the same time, Empedocles placed Bougene Andraprora, man-faced cow creatures, among the strange creatures of the earliest days of creation, when hybridity was closely connected to the jumbled and disorderly chaos out of which sprang early primeval forms, many of them monstrous. Many creatures were born with faces and breasts on both sides, man-faced ox progeny, while others again sprang forth as ox-headed offspring of man, creatures compounded partly of the nature of male, partly of the nature of female, and fitted with shadowy parts. So in the realm of myth and cosmology, Achelous is only half human, and like most human-animal hybrids, is at very best problematic. Nearly 30 years ago, Anthony Snodgrass drew attention to what he called the 4-footed convention in archaic art, whereby the combination of human-type head and torso with a quadruped body was used by artists as a symbol of monstrosity and otherness. Achelous fits squarely into this category. And there's even another aspect of this monstrous hybridity that also bears on his suitability as a border marker. Achelous also seeks the hand of Deianira, Heracles' future wife, so that his monstrosity, or at least his ever-morphing hybridity, betokens an assault on social convention. Deianira complains in Trachiniae, for my suitor was a river god, Achelous, who in 3 shapes was always asking me from my father. coming now as a bull in visible form, now as a serpent, sheeny and coiled, now ox-faced with human trunk, while from his thick shaded beard well-heads of fountain water sprayed. Just as Pholos's assault on Deianira occasions the wrath of Heracles, an act of hubris that subverts good order, so too the shape-shifting river god does not belong to the world of human social convention, among which stands the marriage negotiation. He's not a suitable suitor, but is a worthy opponent of Heracles to defeat. So Achelous, while powerful, in his own way venerable, even awesome, is not fit for human society. He's beyond the pale. The pale, you may remember, was originally the border or barrier around Dublin, which separated the English from the Irish. From the English point of view, the Irish were beyond the pale. What lies beyond is what must be kept out. While Aetolia and Acarnania were peer polities, exchanging this is not a gang sign, exchanging populations, allowing intermarriage, forging ties based on comparable military strength, displaying utterly similar administrative structures, they nevertheless had a river running through their midst that was double and triple determined as a marker of deep, one might almost say, ontological difference. Can deep difference exist where there is, from one perspective, similarity? Ask that of the Flemish and Walloon Belgians, of Indians and Pakistanis. Ask that of Southerners and Yankees, of Yoruba and Igbo groups in Nigeria. Achelous is the perfect example of a border between two elements that keeps alive difference in defiance of similarity. Today, Italo-Acarnania is a single region of Western Greece. The river god reifies difference. Why? Why? Why this manic drive on the part of so many Greek polities to cling to difference and to give it definitional exactitude? The notion that there is an inevitable tendency to demarcate borders will not suffice as an explanation because it's flatly contradicted by early Greek interstate arbitration. When the Opuntian Locrians established a colony at Naupactus in Azolian Locris, they carefully delimited the terms according to which the colonists had obligations and protections to and in their new community, while also having recourse to the legal protection of their old community under specified conditions. Yet even though the inscription is in the West Locrian script, and was erected at Callion, there is only a single mention of any people from West Locris and no concern with setting boundaries for an East Locrian settlement in West Locrian territory. The West Locrians were early adopters of the epigraphic habit, and a famous treaty negotiated in the first half of the 5th century between Callion and Ianthea involved protecting Xenoi from seizure. Yet here too, the two parties, were perfectly content to leave the question of the borders between them unasked. Of far greater importance in the archaic and classical period was the establishment of connections, especially what Catherine Morgan has called communities of cult, that might map onto lines of communication, seasonal interaction, pastoral movement, the exchange of goods, services, and technologies. As a result, to use her words directly, social boundaries were not constant in political salience or very often physical location, and their material expression thus varied in chronology, intensity, and manner. Indeed, the strong expression of borders in the material record is a very patchy phenomenon. In fact, one could probably make the case that prior to the Hellenistic period, the only aspect of territoriality broadly concerned or conceived that consistently resulted in a procedure for settling borders was the formal designation of sacred land. I'm not referring, of course, to Horos inscriptions concerned with private properties, leases, or mortgages, but rather with decisions taken by institutions at the level of the polis and above. Sacred land was marked off, which involved an apparatus of inspection and authentication. This practice is well attested in the Athenian regulations concerning the boundaries and boundary markers used to delineate the Oregas, the sacred land that lay adjacent to the sanctuary of Eleusis, facing Megara. The borders of this land were a matter of importance because the Athenians considered taking it out of production, and so needed to know precisely how far the tract stretched. Prior to putting the question to the Pythia, the Athenians therefore had to mark the exact limits of the land. Their deliberations, recorded in IG 2 cubed 1 292, stipulate, and there shall be present the king and the hierophant, the torchbearer and the Kerikes and the Eumolpidae and any other Athenian who wishes, excuse me, so that they may place the markers as piously and justly as possible. The Pelagori performed similar inspections at Delphi on behalf of the Amphictyons, and in some rare instances, the entire Chora of a state was included under the umbrella of sacred land. As a result of the Aelians' epimelia of Olympia, all of the Chora of Elis was declared sacred, a notable blurring of categories. But generally, the definition of sacred land was different from the negotiation of bilateral territorial agreements. I emphasize the general indifference towards exact borders in the earlier centuries of community life in Greece, outside of the sphere of sacred land, in order to draw attention to the fact that the phenomenon of border settlements is very much a feature of the Hellenistic period, about which I wish to make two claims that strike me as demonstrable and significant regarding Greek border arbitration. The first claim is that interstate arbitrations are overwhelmingly the concern of small states. And the second is that the impetus to settle borders juridically is primarily a response to the encroachment of Macedonian power under Antigonus Gonatas. In contemporary political terms, I'm suggesting that the Hellenistic world experienced asymmetrical power relations, unlike anything that existed previously in the Greek world. In the broadly symmetrical world of archaic and classical Greece, power was largely held by elite landholders. Political tensions had revolved around the extension of civic participation from this narrow landholding elite to, occasionally, a broader base of enfranchised but non-elite citizens. Various institutions, from religious cult to benefactions, channeled elite domination into socially acceptable outlets, but the scale on which this played out was at the level of the city and town. That, in a sense, is the map of archaic and classical Greece. But the vulnerability of this symmetrical system was revealed by the Peloponnesian War and its aftermath, when no single actor was capable of establishing a long-lasting, comprehensive hegemony. This is a narrative you're all familiar with. It was memorably summed up in Xenophon's remark after the Battle of Mantinea, when he says, when this battle occurred, the opposite of what everyone expected took place, since virtually everyone in Greece had participated, everyone supposed that whoever won would become the rulers of all Greece. But God ordained that both sides would put up a trophy. Neither side was any better off as regards territory or power than before. In fact, there was even more confusion and disorder in Greece after the battle than before. A hegemony encompassing the entire Greek peninsula would fall to Macedon thanks to Philip's victory at Chaeronea. But again, the instability of the final third of the 4th century saw all the energies and resources of the Greeks directed outwards towards the conquest of the Achaemenid realm and the protracted wars of the Diadochean period in the generation before and after 300 BC. But once the dust settled from these conflicts, the political landscape of Greece had been transformed beyond recognition. International powers such as the Antigonids and Ptolemies would now regularly intervene in the affairs of small states, subventing their grain supply, endowing them with benefactions, installing permanent garrisons. The scale of these activities was enormous. Cassander and Demetrius Poliorcetes both founded, besieged, and captured cities across a broad swathe of Greek territory. Pyrrhus campaigned in Epirus, Italy, and the Peloponnese. And as local wars between neighboring states now dwindled in significance, the loose confederations north and south of the Gulf of Corinth found it expedient and sensible to refashion themselves. No longer simply clusters of communities linked solely by ethnic affiliation, territorial contiguity, seasonal markets, occasional deliberative sessions, and sanctuary-based cultic performances. They now adopted more formal structures that still carried much of the ethnic substrate, but now added regular assemblies, office holders, federal coinage, and laws. Border settlements were part of that apparatus of the koinon structure. Even if regularly, the parties were themselves part of a larger aggregation, as in the case of Epidaurus and Corinth, both members of the Achaean League, whose border disagreement was adjudicated by a board of Megarian judges. The two overwhelming factors in international politics of the 3rd century were the continued existence of a plethora of small communities, towns, and cities, and the asymmetrical presence of dynasts and kings. Establishing a working relationship between the two was a complex and difficult task, which relied on vague and nebulous principles, sometimes expressed as little more than slogans. For example, early in the Diadocan period, Antigonus Monophthalmus began touting the freedom of the Greeks, a principle that reflected deep-rooted attachments to autonomy without specifying what this meant on the ground. But even as kings were touting this, their armies were still campaigning all over Greece. When it seemed in the 280s that Demetrius Poliorcetes might replicate Alexander's eastern expedition, a coalition of Seleucus, Ptolemy, Lysimachus, and Pyrrhus attacked Macedon from two sides and by sea. And then, in the subsequent reversal of Demetrius's fortunes, his son Antigonus Gonatas took control of most of the Greek mainland before reclaiming the Macedonian throne, defeating the Gallic invaders, and eventually also defeating Pyrrhus. The point of this, and I won't bore you with any more of this overview narrative, the point of this brief narrative is to highlight the changes of the early 3rd century. Greece was a chessboard on which all pieces had shared a kind of parity, like pawns, but now saw the addition of much more powerful pieces, kings, knights, and rooks, change the playing field with consequences for all other pieces, big and small. Antigonus Gonatas' rule, which would last for 50 years until 239, was shaped by this asymmetry. On the one side were the realities of power, which required Antigonus to involve himself directly in the affairs of small states. No man ever set up more absolute rulers in Greece than Antigonus, observed Polybius. Gonatas installed a succession of tyrants in major Peloponnesian cities such as Sicyon and Argos, as well as smaller cities such as Chaeronea, Elis, and Megalopolis. Yet on the other side, Gonatas appealed to the freedom of the Greeks, which was always understood in a Greek context to mean local autonomy. Communities were therefore caught in a bind. The more autonomy was guaranteed on paper, the less it appeared to be real on the ground. Maintaining territorial integrity was not a guarantee of security, but it was a mode of asserting autonomy, even if this was primarily hortatory. A later manifestation of this in German history would be called Kleinstädterei, and it has been called the single most salient characteristic of German history throughout the early modern period. It underlay and conditioned development in all areas of public life. A similar claim could be made for autonomy and territorial integrity in Hellenistic Greece. The asymmetrical power differential created by Antigonid domination, as made manifest in the fetters of Greece, underscored the vulnerability of small states and prompted a corresponding attention to local autonomy, the protection of local resources, the affirmation of each community's independent existence as a legal entity. Ironically, this was most deeply felt in the very places that were least significant. How many people here have heard of Halai and Boumelitai, of Gonoi in Peribea, of Mondaia and Azoros? All states that made energetic attempts to secure their borders through arbitration in the mid-3rd century. And notice how many of these little states engaged in border arbitration were in the very regions closest to Macedon. If the Macedonians could build garrisons at Demetrius, Chalcis, and Corinth, annexation was always on the cards. As a response to the political realities of the Hellenistic age, border arbitration can be seen as another instrument in a toolkit used by states to carve out a place for themselves in international politics. A toolkit that also included declarations and negotiations over asilia, inviolability. There remains a tendency to minimize the significance of such efforts. One detects this in Kent Rigsby's summary of the civic title Sacred and Inviolable, in which, quote, we can see a spirit of self-assertion on the part of the Greek city-states in the face of this new situation of relative powerlessness, end quote. But that's an oversimplification. Powerlessness may entail being subject. It may entail being subject to a higher power, but on a daily basis, most Greek states could avoid intrusive external control by acting in compliance with the hegemon's wishes. by demonstrating that they were no threat, or by creating juridical ties that linked local autonomy to unthreatening subordination. This is illustrated by documents from the Chancellery of Philip V. In one case, Philip writes to the koinon of the people of Abai and guarantees the atelia of their sacred estate. In that correspondence, Philip couches his decision in terms of goodwill and friendliness. He says, King Philip to the koinon of the Abaians, greetings. Your ambassadors to me, Aminius, Pancarides, Sotimus, Archidamus, Euanor, Archias, and Nikonoulos? Yeah, it is Nikonoulos, sorry.
I guess Nicobulos.
Nicobulos? I think probably Nicobulos, I'm sorry. Handed over your decision and then discussed it with me, that the tax-free status of your sacred land might continue as before. So, by heaven, and wishing to show you favour, I've therefore written to Heraclides not to worry you. I love the me enoklein. It's like a Greek mother speaking to a child. Mini enoklis, pedimo. Don't annoy me. In a similar exchange, which probably involves Philip and the disposition of more sacred land in Eastern focus, the inscription refers to a letter involving a transfer of land to the sanctuary of Apollo and Artemis, in which the phrase, whatever you yourselves decide, seems to lend support to the notion that the Macedonian king was being consulted for approval with regard to matters that scarcely involved major foreign policy decisions, but might have local economic consequences. The Macedonian kings may have come as conquerors, but they were being pulled into the disputes of the Greeks, where a bureaucratic morass awaited them. When petitioned by the Larissans over their manpower woes, Philip had instructed them to grant citizenship to the non-citizens in their midst. They did so, but the names were subsequently erased from the citizen rolls, an indicator, of local pushback, which occasioned a stern dressing down from Philip. King Philip to the Targoian city of Larissa, greetings. I'm informed that those who were put on the citizen rolls in accordance with my written instructions and your decree, and were then recorded on the stelae, have had their names erased. If this has happened, your advisors have missed the mark, both as concerns your interests and my decision. I think that no one would deny that it is by far the best outcome for the city to grow strong, and for as many as possible to have a share in the body politic, and for the land not to sit shamefully underused as it is now. The Larissans wisely voted to re-register more than 200 people, and underscoring the bureaucratic entanglement of small states and Macedonian kings, he tells the Larissans to defer any decision about people who've done something especially heinous, heos anego epitrepsas apotes strateas diacuso, until I return from campaign, when I shall hear the case. This is the point where the top, the asymmetrical relationship, is meeting the bottom part. Accordingly, the asymmetry created by superpowers at the border and ranging freely over peninsular Greece had another consequence. Ironically, border disputes of a trivial nature could be referred to higher powers, such as Philip V and later the Roman Senate, for adjudication. What had been low-level conflict or just disagreement was weaponized by the existence of the Macedonian court or a senatorial commission. Now, to be clear, I am not arguing that it was automatic or inevitable or a necessary stage of political evolution that the Greeks developed a formal system of international arbitration. The collections of Giovanna Verrocchi and Sheila Ager reveal that arbitration processes were piecemeal and irregular, but they weren't haphazard and random. There were identifiable forces at work built into the political systems that continued to evolve across time, from the archaic period, in which sanctuaries and festivals were the institutions shaping international relations, to the Hellenistic, when first Macedon and then Rome would be drawn into negotiating interstate negotiations. The decemviri of the 140s were not an alien imposition of Roman law on conquered Greece. They were the logical culmination of a process in which border negotiations were part of the strategy of small states for making autonomy meaningful. And one last factor. The presence of superpowers brought with it one quite specific challenge: taxes. Border settlement was bound up with autonomy in the abstract, but practically in the question of who could assess and extract taxes. For this reason, asilia was economically important. Throughout the 2nd century, Delphi petitioned Roman generals such as Achilles Glabrio and the Senate regarding control of the sacred land. They received assurances of goodwill from the first, and in 189 BC received an answer that both endorsed their control of the Hierachora and acknowledged that the Delphians were autonomous, free, and tax exempt. In fact, the asilia of a sanctuary could extend out to the host community with economic consequences. For example, as asilia came to be negotiated across a network of cities, sanctuaries, and federal bodies, the Delphic Amphictyony recognized that Levadia was now covered by the asilia of Trophonius and Zeus Basileus, and that Acryphia was dedicated to Apollo Ptoios and was within the orbit of his sanctuary. Both sanctuaries were authorized to collect hierachremata, katapasan horan, and were protected by Delphian proclamation. A second fuller declaration by the Amphictyonic Council further specified that the temple of Apollo Ptoios at Acryphia was to be asilos, just like or in accordance with the boundaries marked by the stele, as in the case of Delphi. So what we've got is towns leveraging their oracles for income to pay for upkeep and the cost of festivals, and seeking recognition for this under the umbrella term of inviolability, an expression which, like the freedom of the Greeks, could be a slogan, but it could also raise the possibility of tangible benefit, either tax exemption or actual revenue. Since the locus of this was sacred property, subject to clear borders, the impetus again towards border settlement gained even more strength. Perhaps ironically, the final piece of evidence for the intertwining of strict border management, sacred property, and inviolability comes from the greatest violator of all of these, Lucius Cornelius Sulla. Despite plundering far and wide, Sulla had a soft spot for Amphiaraus and his sanctuary at Oropos. And in a dossier of inscriptions there, Sulla wrote, in fulfillment of a vow I attached to the temple of Amphiaraus, land in every direction for 1 mile in order that this land be inviolable. The Senate confirmed this, acknowledging that, quote, all the revenues from the city territory and ports of Oropos were assigned to Amphiaraus. But on appeal from the Publicani through their representative Lucius Domitius Ahenobarbus, the Senate, this is a great moment, the Senate in true Solomonian fashion found that Sulla's dispensations were legal insofar as they pertained to the gods, but they annulled his arrangements pertaining to Oropos on the grounds that Amphiaraus was not a god. That's how you define a problem out of existence. His precincts, therefore, were not protected, but could be taxed by tax officials. In short, tax revenues trumped all other considerations. The business of determining borders, therefore, may be said to have undergone continuous change from the archaic period to the Roman, which I would summarize as follows. Borders are rarely the exclusive concern of two parties of broadly comparable size and status. As an artifact of social interaction, borders reflect a wider range of community concerns that include borderland resources, religious prestige, and the economics of sanctuaries. Borders are in most times and places defined by practice and use, not legal intervention. 4, border arbitrations are linked to the complexification of Greek life and institutions, parallel and in tandem with comparable developments, such as the extension of Asilia and Atelia, resulting in a political landscape of interlocking and overlapping communities, a network rather than a mosaic. 5th, hardening borders through arbitration is a response to the asymmetry of power that characterized the Hellenistic age. Finally, a note of warning against using our own framework and categories to understand the Greeks. It's easy to see ancient Greek borders as the product of the same dynamic forces that have produced the modern state system that we took for granted until about a month ago. But what's coming, I don't know. But the ancient Greek model is different, varied, scalar, flexible. It carried within it earlier patterns of community organization, polis, kome, ethnos, koinon, and adapted these as far as possible to find a place for communities, however modest, in a newly emerging world order. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Jeremy, for this fascinating talk. Really fascinating talk. Rich and stimulating.
Sorry,
I think that this is a joke we had during lunch. In any case, very fascinating paper. And I guess there would be a lot of questions and remarks, both online and here in the room. So we will break the ice as usual. This is always the... Oh, great. Luca Valle Salazar, a PhD student working on Euripides and borders in Euripides recently.
Excuse me, does Luca need the microphone?
Yes, he needs the microphone. Giusto. Vuole fare lei, Luca? O insomma.
Sorry, Luca, just I know Zoom people can hear me, but maybe not you.
Yes, you're right. Especially for those online. For those online. Deve accenderlo però.
Hello?
Yeah.
No, okay. Thank you very much for this talk. It was really interesting.
Not rich.
Well, also rich, I guess.
Sorry.
I just had a question because I recently have been researching a bit about monsters in Antiquity, and as you talked a bit about, because there is this connection between monsters and borders. Cohen, Asma, a lot of scholars speak about this, and I mean, what I was thinking about is that these monsters are placed there to inspire terror in the most terror, or however, like to police the borders in order to separate what is us from what is them, and so like to impede some communication, to separate, but also to they can like borders can foster communication. And monsters, as many scholars observe, not only inspire terror but also curiosity. Like today we have the dark tourism or a lot of manifestations, and in the ancient times, in ancient Greece, the curiosity for monstrosity is sometimes attested to. I mean, in the back I can see this about Dionysus, right, who is the other, like a monstrous other, but he still inspires a lot of curiosity on Pentheus. So what about borders? Monsters, like monsters in borders and borders in general. Do you think that they have this potential to, in ancient times, in ancient Greece, to inspire the curiosity to go further and learn from the other?
Absolutely. And can I do a bit of shameless self-promotion? The last book I've done, which Eleanor hasn't seen yet, is called Centaurs and Snake Kings. And it's about the role of hybridity in Greek culture. And my response to your perfectly appropriate question is that hybrids and monsters both exist in the Greek imagination, but they're not identical. Monsters scare you. Hybrids may, I mean, most monsters are hybrids, but not all hybrids are monsters. Pegasus is a hybrid, but he's not a monster. So the theoretical framework that I've tried to employ addressing the sort of thing you're talking about is Freud's notion of the unheimlich, because there you find that you're looking at or experiencing something which is somehow familiar, and it may be odd, but it's not necessarily, oh God, get me out of here. It's more often, that's very strange. My favorite image for this, which I didn't put into this lecture, is a bronze attachment for a cauldron in the National Museum in Athens. It's a 6th century bronze that shows a man facing a centaur. And you realize when you look at it from outside as us, we see a man, a human, and we see a centaur. But if you look at it from the point of view of the axis that runs through the piece, the centaur looking at the man and the man looking at the centaur, they're actually almost identical. The centaur bit is only strapped onto his backside. And so I think that perfectly captures the idea that many creatures are hybrids, but not monstrous. In fact, I would say that Achelous, in many representations, is being presented as a hybrid, but not necessarily monstrous. These are very fuzzy boundaries. They're not hard. So go ahead.
I'm thinking of Proteus too in the Odyssey. They say that he changes forms and he obviously is a terrifying creature somehow, but his real form is never really specified, and his effects are not only those of terror, but also those of, Menelaus have to capture him, he had to go near to him, and so yeah.
Can I also mention that I think we sometimes miss the presence of this throughout the rest of Greek culture. There are many places where I think local versions of gods are not like the Olympian versions at all. If you think about Phigalia, particularly in the Peloponnese, Eurynome is worshipped there, and Pausanias' description makes it pretty clear. She looks like a mermaid. It's a woman's torso, but a fish's tail. Or Demeter Horse, who is depicted as, and he again describes this, as the body of a woman with the head of a horse. And we don't get many of those in Homer. In Hesiod, they're part of these elaborate genealogies of monstrosity. But even there, notice the way in which in Hesiod, when the Gorgon is killed and a head is cut off, the blood gushes out, and from that are born Pegasus, who is a hybrid but not a monster, and Chrysaor, who is a human who's neither monster nor hybrid. So I would suggest that, in fact, in Greek culture, the idea of humanity and hybridity are like DNA. They're sort of entwined around each other. And occasionally one version will pop out that is monstrous, but in many places they're not.
That's really a beautiful answer. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
And very rich.
Thank you, Luca.
Any other questions? By Sebastian, great.
Yeah, thank you for this wonderful presentation. I have a question precisely about your last point on the slide, because it struck me that all this interstate arbitration, which we have as a Hellenistic phenomenon, as you put it, if we could describe it in terms of glocalization, probably, so as a counter movement to this expansion of the Greek world with Alexander. So
absolutely. There is a way in which some Greek borders are about the moment when Greek speakers with Greek stories and Greek imaginations and Greek histories are encountering other people. And then there are moments where you're looking at someone on the other side of the hill, the other side of the river, the other side of the mountain. So that self and other, what Emily Begawarinath refers to as the home and away in Herodotus, is very much a feature here. And that's, again, I think why the notion of Unheimlichkeit is really useful, because sometimes you look at something across and you hear it, it sounds sort of like what you understand, but not quite. Or, you know, if you sail into a port in, if you sail into Panormos, or if you sail into Agrigento, and you hear voices that are not speaking Greek, it's an other. Or there might be people speaking Greek, but it's a really weird and funky accent. And that, to me, is the sort of most genuine Greek experience, the encounter with a whole range of possibilities of similarity and difference. So glocality, as you put it, I think is very much a response to the widening world at the local level.
I recently came across an Acarnanian who hunted elephants for the Ptolemies in Nubia in the 3rd century. This might be some of such.
Thank you. Yeah, I'll follow up on that. Yeah.
Sorry, can I jump in? This is very interesting discussion. No, okay, so I don't. With a rich answer.
Rich answer coming up.
No, you gave a very convincing explanation to the question why border disputes and why the linearity of borders spread precisely in the Hellenistic period. So my question is, if I can ask a question. Would you go so far to exclude that we have linear borders in the archaic and classical period? There is a debate about this.
Well, epigraphically, I don't think we do. Do you think we have border inscriptions? I mean, we have Horos inscriptions, and one from Crete. Okay, all right. Well, ask Angelos. But
an exception.
I don't think they're very common at all.
You know.
I don't think they're very common at all. I think they're a Hellenistic phenomenon. And it's precisely,
Me too.
trying to think about the specificity of the ones that we do have that made me think, gee, a lot of these are really small places and a lot of them are really insignificant. So why have they got so much invested in it? But, many of you will have been able to tell from this paper that the approach I'm taking here is really inspired a lot by people like Simon Price and John Marr, who've developed a whole way of seeing international relations in both the Hellenistic and in the Roman period as not top-down impositions, but rather as bottom-up responses with negotiation. And so I'm trying to play with that idea of the asymmetry of the big kings and the small towns, but to see, I wonder, when Philip got a letter that said, those folks down in Larissa have rubbed the names off the boards, did he say, well, I'll have to correct that? Would he say, for God's sake, where the hell is Larissa again? I don't know, Emma, what do you have a sense of? But, seriously, do these great kings feel as if this is how I make power real? Because I suspect that we tend to think still in terms of borders of territories that have been taken over and have been controlled. I think we are conditioned to think in terms of Putin taking land from Ukraine. That's a typical, violation of a border, and that's where it's contested. But I think in the Hellenistic world, these kings don't have the manpower and they don't have the time or the resources to be sending massive armies everywhere, which can only march, 40 kilometers a day? So these are expensive expeditions. What's much more important is that you get collaboration from communities. And I think the striking thing, I think that Simon Price showed this in his book, 30 years ago, that Greek communities are sort of hardwired to approach the next big power and to say, what can we do? We want you here. We'll put up a statue to you. Well, tell us what it takes. And the Greek kings are, in a sense, being brought into an existing system. And it's not merely a matter of an imposition of power from above, but a negotiation of relationships that goes up and down and is framed by this asymmetry of power, I think.
Thanks, Jeremy, for this lovely talk. I think for this super rich, extraordinarily rich talk, I think it is of the utmost importance what you said, among the other things, in the end, that the Greek pattern of border is completely different from our own. Greek borders are fluid, scalar, you said, interscalar, flexible, and so on. Would you go so far as to say that Greek borders are not dividing lines, are not only dividing lines, but also somehow lines that mark a common belonging, a common sharing under the same umbrella? To the very differentiation among two or more Greek dialects implies that those two versions of Greek are parts, different versions of the Greek language. So they do not only divide borders, but also mark somehow a commonality.
Yeah.
And also, you emphasize, or we tend to emphasize differences when we speak about borders, but the Greek word is so rich in terms of commonalities, overlappings, mutual influence, and so on, that don't you think that borders somehow in the Greek conception also mark that line that was somehow advisable to overcome, to enrich one's own world?
Yeah, I like the sound of that. I think the slight complexity is that borderlands are often in areas that are subject to economic exploitation in a way that doesn't fit well with the city model and with the cultivation of land model. And so there's a kind of city-country dynamic that's playing out here, where often this town will say, well, this is us, and this town will say, this is us. But in between, what you've often got is, in fact, a mountain or a plateau. And of course, sheep and shepherds don't really care much about those sorts of boundaries. This is, in fact, what I'm going to be talking about in the colloquium tomorrow for the second paper. Yeah. The second rich paper in 2 days. I expect to see you all there. Where I do think, in fact, what happens is there is a common area, and sometimes the negotiation has to be, how exactly are we going to conduct this? So, you think about the famous inscription from Tedja, from the Athena Alea sanctuary, where it specifies, if you're going to bring your animals to the festival, you can stay for 3 days on the sacred land, but you can't graze any longer than that. I think it's a fascinating inscription because it's one of the first instances, I think, of an inscription showing an awareness of the danger of over-exploiting the land. Similarly, up on Parnassus, where the Phocians and the Locrians, come to blows, that's an area where, on a day-to-day basis, you'll have a Phocian shepherd and you'll have a Locrian shepherd, and they might say, hey Joe, how's it going? Or it might be, you've been here for 3 days. Now bugger off because I want to bring my animals up here. And so, occasionally it'll come to blows, but it's low-level conflict, and occasionally it's probably worked out by the guys. In some of the border inscriptions we've got that deal with these very lands, they'll actually say, Ta Miania and Ta Hypnia, the Maianian land and the Hypnian land, maintained by those two territories, and the common territory will be held in common. Yes, exactly. Yeah. Exactly. And so there they just say, there's no point in drawing a line down the middle because it's a zone, not a line. So I think sometimes these are in tension with each other. Is that?
Yeah. There is a question by Ben, then Emma, and then Michael. Maybe about Oroi and the FeBiCos? No. Which is your expertise? Not.
Lots.
No. A question and 3 comments.
Yeah.
3 comments and a question. I love the image of Aboriginals dancing and singing their borders into existence. And I was thinking a bit about mobile borders theory, which I've touched upon very, very briefly.
Right.
And how much you think, I'm thinking always on Delos, how much especially, and Christie's actually written about how Delians shored up their own local cults in the face of Athenian presence. Let's call it a presence. How much do theoric delegations, religious processions, the Pythos to Delphi, act as sort of mobile borders in the sense that you have up to hundreds of people from a city-state going to somewhere outside the city-state, performing rituals either particular to that place or particular to them, and then going home.
Yeah.
It's obviously at a practical level, those people then get a greater understanding of the geography.
Yeah.
But conceptually, the border of their city-state has moved into another context.
Absolutely. I completely agree. And in fact, if there's anyone here looking for a dissertation topic, I hope you don't mind me selling this, but you know how Vincent Rosavach wrote a book 30 years ago about the calendar of sacrifice in Athens, and he sat down and calculated based on the inscriptional evidence and the law speeches, how many sacrifices were held in Athens at any given time or over the course of a year. And it really gave us a very concrete sense of just how rich the calendar of sacrifice was in Athens. She's not paying attention. So that, now we know basically every 8 days or so, you've got a major sacrifice, and that has an elementary result in a lot of meat becoming available. I think it would be a great thing to sit down and look at all of the theoric inscriptions that we've got. I mean, think of the wealth of evidence from Samothrace, for example, and to chart when is this happening and who is going. If you go through the Delos accounts, those accounts are so deceptive because you'll see, we deposited 6 drachmas for a dead goose, and we deposited 5 drachmas from bird guano that we sold. And you think, boy, they're really following every element carefully. And then when you see how the money is paid out, it'll be a talent paid out to the theoroi. Tiny revenues coming in, but big expenditures out to people going on these theoria. If you were to map this across the Greek world to the Panhellenic sanctuaries, to the Stephanitic games, every time a place sends out an announcement about Asulia that involves a theoria going out, I think you would see a Greek landscape that is not static and is not defined by fixed borders, but is actually a constant negotiation of people on the move.
I mean, on Delos, if the year was right, you could have up to 4 from Athens, including the Delia, which was obviously multiple days.
And small areas like the Tetrapolis in the north of Attica has its own Pythia.
Yes, yeah.
Its own Pythia. So even little groups, is it a state Pythia? No, it's a suburban Pythia.
Yeah.
I think that really is part of the fabric of Greek life. That when people write now about mobility, they're thinking about, oh, well, in the Hellenistic period, we have doctors from Kos who are pointed here, or we've got mercenaries, or we've got traders. But you've also got a religious network that is actually connecting all of these places in a massive network of movement. I think that's absolutely right. They're mobile borders.
Cheers.
Sorry, by Emma. Grazie, Rebecca. Hanno fatto da soli. Emma Aston.
Thank you. I think probably the answer to this question is just going to be no, and that's fine. But I was just wondering about maps. They're obviously so important to the imperialist carving up of territory that you contrast Greek practice with, and obviously nothing to do with the walking autopsy process of drawing up a boundary decree where people are there on the ground looking at kind of topographical features and so on and not consulting maps at all. But they're sort of there in literature, aren't they? I was thinking about Aristophanes' Clouds, where you've got Socrates showing a map to the old guy who says, well, where's my village? I can't see my fellow villagers on it. And I just wondered whether they're there in the background in a different sort of register of thinking about boundaries and territories, and whether they're ever formative on other sort of more real life processes, or whether they're just a sort of footling abstraction on the periphery. I think probably the latter, but I'd be interested in your thoughts on that.
That's a great question. And there are a couple of things. First of all, the person who most influenced the way I think about the relationship between mapping and space is, in fact, the Italian scholar Yanni, who introduced the notion of spazio ideologico, I believe he calls it. The notion that for the Greeks, the lived experience of travel was you went from A to B, from B to C, from C to D. And cabotage trade certainly influences that. And even when you think about the Periplus literature, it's still largely carrying on that tradition. So it's always seemed to me that the few references to maps are largely about, whoa, that's really so alien, Herodotus and bringing a map to Sparta. Oh, you think we're going that far? Get out of here. It's almost as if the map is a confrontation where we think of it as a kind of reflection of reality, a distillation of it. And the Greek reaction is that can't be right. I don't recognize my world there. Does it play over into other areas? Can you tease out a little bit more, even speculatively, where we might go with that?
Well, actually, your answers made me pretty convinced that it's not. In fact, I'm now thinking we should classify maps as unheimlich.
Yeah.
Because they're uncanny little facsimiles of something that is so different.
Yeah.
So I think I've talked myself into thinking that the answer to my question is definitely no, but they are quite. I mean, I guess I was thinking about people like Strabo. I've always been interested by the way he sort of cuts up Thessalian geography, and particularly the way that people use rivers, and do think of them as quite definite lines, whereas in fact actually they are the absolute opposite, that people come down to their banks to water their livestock or to check their fish traps. So I suppose I was imagining that literary sources might possibly have a map informed view.
Right.
Which then does violence to what they're trying to, or deviates significantly from what they're trying to describe. And it might be quite interesting to think about that difference. But
yeah. Well, rivers can, play such an interesting role. I mean, I'm not going to go into Celtic mythology where rivers are always, the boundary, and you walk across and then there's a lady from the underworld waiting for you or something like that. But Tina Selloway has done some really interesting work on how many of the water works, which are often associated with rivers in the Peloponnese, are all places where Heracles had been prominent. So there is a way in which they are imprinting themselves onto the imagination of the Greeks. As borders, they're convenient, but they're not necessary. It's an evasive answer. I'm sorry.
No, that's really interesting. Thank you.
I do think that there is a way also that just, thinking about maps as mimetic, there does seem to be a kind of Platonic resistance to maps that, it's not the real thing and therefore it's one step away from reality. I'll bet you that Plato did not have maps in the Republic.
Yeah.
I'm certain of that. And that this is something that Borges plays with. Do you know the short story of the royal map makers? Can I tell you this? The royal map makers is a great story. Borges tells the story of a king who wants to have a map of his kingdom. He wants to be able to see the village, with the people. And so he asks for the royal geographers to make him a map, and they do. And he says, yeah, that's great, but I want more detailed. So they make him a map as big as this room and bring him in. He says, that's okay, but I want something that's really detailed. I want the leaves on the trees and the water wheel on the river. So they go away and they make him a map, which is the size of the kingdom. It's the impossibility of the map. It's a great story. If you haven't read it, I strongly. Sorry. Michael, did you have a question?
Oh, thank you for your interesting and rich talk. During your talk, you talked about the sacred orgasm and the Eleusinian mysteries. My question is, in your opinion, is it possible that borders could be negotiated also in the case of festivals? I refer in particular to an incident in the Athenian history right before the Peloponnesian War, when Megarians killed one of Athenian ambassador, Antimocritus, and then they were forbidden to take share in the Eleusinian mysteries, and the Athenians erected an inscription at the sacred gate in commemoration of this horrible crime. And it seems to me that this action, the erection of the inscription, is a sort of recreation of a new border between Athens and Megara, in the sphere of the festival, and also the sphere, in the religious sphere, but also in the field of policy, in the light of the political crisis which faced the Megarians and the Athenians at the beginning of the Peloponnesian War. And so my question is if borders could be negotiated also in the context of these festivals, Pan-Hellenic festivals.
It's a great question, and Eleusis is such a fascinating place because, as many of you will know, there's always been a debate about was Eleusis ever separate from Athens? I can remember one of the archaeologists at the Eleusis Museum years ago saying to me, well, the material culture is identical to Athens in every period, so it was always Athenian. Whereas the more recent work by a German scholar whose name I'm blanking on, do you remember who I'm thinking of? Matthias? No. Ronenberg. Anyway, sorry. Someone who's been working on Eleusis recently has argued, no, the material culture is quite distinct from Athens, and it's really a series of separate communities, which then aggregate in probably the 7th century. And if it is separate from Athens, Eleusis may have a local identity, to get back to your point, that's different from Athenian or Megarian. And in fact, in some of the myth layers associated with Eleusis, say the priests of the cult, they affiliate with Argos. And so it does seem to me that cultural and myth borders may not map well onto political borders and may often be in tension with that. And, thinking of gates are a very powerful area to investigate here. And think about the Arch of Hadrian. One side says this is the city of Theseus, and the other side says this is not the city of Theseus. I mean, there's nothing more black and white than a gateway between territories. So that's a very powerful border. Except
Thank you very much.
It's all in Athens. Thank you.
Any more questions or remarks?
Interventions?
Interventions? Yes. Please, a student,
Good.
a master student.
She
Prego.
was nodding when I was talking about Borges, so whatever you ask, the answer is yes.
Okay. Maybe it's a kind of a philosophical interpretation.
Yeah.
But I'm asking the character of Heracles that defeated Attilos can be read as the Greek man that destroy the borders. It's a I don't know if we can interpret the myth in this way. I don't know. I'm asking this.
Well, I mean, yes, think about what Heracles does whenever he goes west. Bruno D'Agostino argued very convincingly years ago that this was the imposition of Greek-style cult, that every place where he defeats a local or a monster, whether it's Cacus or anyone else, these are always ways in which the Greeks are advertising this is their territory. And I've always thought the analog for that is the erection of temples in the colonies in settings that are so remarkably aggressive. You sail past Agrigento and we're not going to show you a temple from a nice three-quarter view as if you're on the Acropolis. We're going to show you the length of this temple, and then this temple, and then this temple. And the effect is, if you're Greek, come on in. If you're not Greek, keep on going. I think that very oppositional dynamic is built into the Greek response to non-Greeks to the West, and that Heracles is the very embodiment of that. So this is a way in which Western Greece is actually almost a testing ground for what's going to be done out in the farther colonies. And that, I think, actually is a dynamic of imperialism that's worth thinking about. You know, I mean, I come from a place that was a colonial foundation of the Brits, but most of the stuff they did in the New World and in their colonial areas were things that they'd already done in Ireland and Scotland. So, you know, this gets tried out locally and then it gets taken out beyond.
Thank you.
Sure.
Any more questions? Andrea Bianchini. Grazie, Rebecca. A PhD student from Verona collaborating with FeBo.
Thank you for your presentation, first of all. I was wondering, do you think in the latest years, due to this interest, this tendency to focus on connectivity, especially in economical terms, we have neglected the importance of borders, which actually matters, culturally speaking?
That's a very good question. I think that the move towards working on connectivity, like every big shift in historiography, involves a kind of clearing of the undergrowth, you know, getting rid of the way that things were done and the overdetermined categories that were done earlier. I mean, if you read something like Hignet's History of the Athenian Constitution, great book if you're preparing for your exams and you want to learn about Cleisthenes and Solon and Pisistratus in a very positivistic model. If you want to move beyond that and go into a new area, then there are going to be some things that are left behind temporarily. But I mean, not to sound pious, I think the whole point of the FeBo project is to put this back on the agenda. But you know, one can't cover everything. So, I mean, can we drill a little deeper? Is there an aspect of this that you're finding intellectually stultifying or unsatisfactory?
Well, I'm studying Herodotus.
Yep.
I had the impression we always tend to consider border as something constructed,
Yep.
but at the same time, I mean, probably after the 90s, there is this focus on connectivity just because we were in a period characterized by globalization.
Yep.
Nowadays, we are taking into account, we are realizing that borders actually matters.
Yeah.
I mean,
Yeah.
I think we are always influenced, of course, by contemporary trends, by contemporary history.
Yes.
So probably we have just realized in the latest year that borders are a constant problem. I mean, even if you have economic connectivity, at the end of the day, you also have to take into account the thought of people, limits to connectivity,
Sure.
I think.
Let's hone in on Herodotus for a minute. In his treatment of the Ionians, he's clearly responding to a kind of rhetoric in the late 5th century when people think there are Ionians, there are Ionians and then there are Dorians, ne'er the twain shall meet. And so as soon as he starts to talk about the Ionians, he says, well, actually, even though there are 12 Ionian cities, there are only 12 Ionian cities because there were 12 Ionian cities back in the North Peloponnese, where they came from. And then he says, and in fact, of those groups, some of them were rejected because of a crime. Some of them speak Greek differently from the others around them. And he actually undercuts the false idea that there is such a thing as an Ionian singularity. And it seems to me that he's actually a very good model for how we should be approaching these sorts of things. There are borders, but sometimes there are fiction. There are borders. Sometimes people act on that fiction, but that's as real as if it's a reality. So there is a kind of self-constituted reality that exists in there. Yeah.
Thank you very much.
But I'm hoping that Borders Point 2, which we're doing, will be better than Borders Point 1, which was there is a line and these are those and these are they. And you're quite right. We don't want to completely reject the idea of borders, just to finesse what they mean, and particularly to think of them as being more dynamic. The term that Ayrton Pellini uses is the evoluatif. They're developing, they're unfolding.
And culturally constructed as well.
Absolutely. Well, that's a given, I think.
And I think, sorry for jumping in again, but I think that the very concept of interconnectivity makes sense only if borders matter.
Yeah, right.
Otherwise, it doesn't make sense.
Otherwise, it's a mush.
Yeah.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Wow, rich debate. Any more questions? We had a very long debate, so maybe if there are no questions, we can close here this wonderful talk. Thank you very much to Jeremy for giving this talk in the framework of FeBo and Confini Instabili. And the next appointment of FeBo is tomorrow, throughout the week with the workshop Federalism and Border Management in the Greek World through time across perspectives. So stay tuned. Thank you.